Hello, class. I did it again. I just checked your Canvas sheet and I haven't put up the assignment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the assignment and the final due the same day. Give you extra days on this to make up for my mistake. I'm so sorry. It's a terrible excuse, but it's so difficult when you have several in-person classes and you have constant attention from students asking you before and after class for this and that. And I lose track with my couple online classes. I'm so sorry. There's no excuse for that. I want to get your names down. It's a familiar set of names here, which I appreciate, and you're going to be rewarded in points. Okay. And I want to go over the last assignment prior to your final. Note also that the final, I'll give an announcement, but you won't have until Sunday like usual for the final, right? That's beyond my control. They have an officially final day of the semester, and I have to abide by it, and as do you. So that might be as early as like Thursday night, okay, next week. And just like that, we're done. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your faithful attendance and just your flexibility, your good attitudes. I'm terribly sorry. All right, and so what we're going to do is we're going to get into Reconstruction. I have two argumentative sections on it, and then yeah, on account of the week being truncated next week on account of finals. I'll send an announcement. I'm going to do a Zoom sooner than Thursday, because that literally might be the last day, the last evening to turn everything in. So if I can, I'm going to even shoot for like Monday or Tuesday at the latest. Okay, at 4 o'clock to meet with you and go over the final. Remember, the questions pertaining to fighting the Civil War, I went ahead based on my failure to put that up in time. I'm going to give you those answers clearly. I'm not going to ever test you on anything that you don't cover. All right. So I will do that and go over the test just generally Monday or Tuesday of next week. All right. But you'll have the same time, like I'll make it the last day of the semester whenever this test 3 or final is due. So will this week's assignment be, okay? Known as Reconstruction. All right, so if you don't mind, are there any questions before I jump into Reconstruction? All right, okay. So let's go ahead and jump in. So the basic narrative of Reconstruction, right? The basic narrative is that the president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, meant to balance his ticket and win over the border states at the time of his reelection, when he said that he really needed Kentucky in particular. He balanced his ticket with a very racist, not progressive at all, poor Southerner whose libertarianism was trumped by his patriotism. And so he chose his country over his local government and state. And for that, he was rewarded to run on the ticket with him. But as far as, like I said, being progressive, like we've gone over court history of the Civil War, an exceptionally idealistic generation that contend, a lot of reformers, utopian movements, abolitionists, all this going on, right? This new type of tendency to force discourse on slavery, to challenge traditional norms, to challenge the Constitution and the tradition of compromise, etc. Andrew Johnson was not caught up in any of that. All right, he was, if anything, regressive. He was certainly conservative. And so now we find him as president, right? When Lincoln is killed. And so he begins by implementing the same simple policy for the South to re-enter the Union. Remember, the 11 states of the Confederacy. And he makes it so easy that it's not interpreted the same way as it likely would have been with Lincoln. A lot of people knew Lincoln's plan before he had a chance to carry it out. He had given a famous speech where he said, right, where with malice toward none and charity toward all, let us bind our wounds and move on. Lincoln had visibly aged during the war. He had proven his anti-slavery credentials by the time all was said and done, even though he was known to be, at best a moderate to the abolitionists. He ended up dying after giving that last speech, trying to push for the enfranchisement of some Black men in Louisiana. So at any rate, when he made it easy for the South to re-enter, it was seen as just that. It was seen as his mercy, his merciful character, his weariness with war, and wanting to move on. But when Johnson made it equally simple for the South to re-enter the Union, it wasn't popularly embraced as such. It was interpreted more of him showing his true colors as a Southern sympathizer, okay, and a regressive. So at any rate, all they had to do is have 1/10 of the population of each state go and sign a formal apology. Then they could, everybody with the pre-Civil War citizenship, so all the old white racist antebellum leaders, all of them immediately re-enfranchised. They could have elections for an assembly, and that state assembly would write a state constitution. And all they had to do, according to Andrew Johnson, was agree to the 13th Amendment, that at least on paper, right, that slavery seen under law holding African Americans as chattel property could no longer exist, for life, inherited biologically, etc. So when that happens, some Southerners get right back into Congress, and Alexander Stephens was a hated figure. He was the vice president of the Confederacy under Jefferson Davis. He was connected to the Fort Pillow massacre. And at any rate, he puts his feet up on his desk and said, something to the effect like, "Did you miss us, boys?" And he chuckled. And there was this great disgust, like, this is just not right. For the very simple reason, right, that 600,000 young men lost their lives in this war, well over 500,000, well over 300,000 in the North alone. So the idea was, right, is have we fought this war for nothing? Okay. And so then in addition to that, to exacerbate things, is Andrew Johnson doesn't wait for the newly elected Congress to come back into session, and he starts unilaterally acting on his own. And so he handpicks, right, temporary governors over the South, and they are racist, regressive, pro-South, etc. All right. So before you know it, they and their new state legislators start issuing black codes, and the black codes were kind of like the subsequent Jim Crow laws, right? Greatly hampered and hindered the opportunities that African Americans had. For instance, because of the Sambo image, of the happy-go-lucky, lazy, impulsive African American man, they made labor contracts, and they mandated that Black men had to have a labor contract at a given time. And then, of course, they just shut off. Some of them just, just in reality. Others did it on paper, actually. They went so far as doing it by law. They deprived them of like artisan jobs, professional white-collar jobs, etc. And so a lot of them had little, if any, choice but to go back to the plantations and work as nominally sharecroppers in this crop lien system. And there's a gentleman right up at UC Davis who has a book called Slavery in All But Name. And it goes over this, right? It really was. I don't think that's hyperbole to say that it was slavery in all but name. They couldn't congregate in numbers above 50. They couldn't carry firearms. They had curfews, all kinds of things to hamper their autonomy. And so at any rate, all this is going on. And then in addition to that, Andrew Johnson begins vetoing some what people considered to be moderate not too controversial, not too radical, not too progressive legislation by Congress. Okay. The two that they normally put in the narrative, they notice, but they're more than these two. But the ones that stand out are the continuation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Remember, the Freedmen's Bureau was established to help aid and succor, I think were the two terms they used, give comfort and help to the African Americans in the South. They provided schools, they provided medical help, economic help. They fought for them in the courts. They even tried to start their own freedmen's court system because the Southern judicial system was so skewed and racist. So at any rate, he contended, right, that the Freedmen's Bureau was racist in its intent because it only aimed primarily to help African Americans. He said, what about the poor white Southerners? So he vetoes that. And then there was a basic 1866 Civil Rights Act that was passed. And remember, like historically, the different levels of citizenship. You have basic rights to property, right? To be remunerated or paid a wage for your work and to keep those wages and spend them as you wish. To rent and purchase property, to start a business, et cetera, right? So economic, inclusion, integration, that's seen oftentimes as kind of the basic level of citizenship. Then perhaps another level of citizenship, certainly a one to consider, is political equality as far as protections under criminal and civil law. So that if someone harms you, if someone wrongs you, you have the right as a citizen to defend yourself and your rights in the court of law, right? And the basic rights, the Bill of Rights, etc., pertain to you. And then thirdly, you have suffrage. And suffrage, right, is a level at which you participate in government. You get to vote, you get to run for office, etc. All right. And then I would add one more component that's not political, but where it seemed to be the litmus test of the most radical for that time period. And that was those who were okay with social integration. And social integration was living side by side with Black neighbors, allowing a Black man to marry your white daughter, etc. That was next level stuff. And it was a very minute percentage of this generation's population that was even willing to remotely contemplate that. So at any rate, going back to this, all the 1866 law stated was the basic first level of citizenship, just economic rights to property and remuneration for their work, right? And he vetoed it. He vetoed it. So what happens is it backfires on him. They have 1866 congressional elections, and he goes on a speaking tour, and he did his cause more harm than good. He had a reputation for being publicly inebriated. Some of his speeches, they said he was just plain drunk. He was bellicose. He was hateful. He used the N-word, which even by then was becoming a very, repugnant word. And so what happens is, in addition to that, is his opponents, the term that their opponents used is that they waved the bloody shirt. That was the popular expression, right? And you could guess what that means. Is metaphorically, they grabbed that Yankee blue uniform that was blood-stained, and they reminded everybody of it, right? And waving that bloody shirt and saying, we lost too many men, we suffered too many setbacks, too much sacrifice has been made for there to be no change at all in the South. The South is virtually, they use the religious term, unrepentant. The unrepentant South. You can see it in the Northern press, that term. They're not sorry. They're not sorry for anything. They're not sorry for the war, etc. And remember, the war had begun because Lincoln said he would unilaterally, in the Stephen Douglas debates, that he would unilaterally not allow slavery to spread to the West if he could. And when he was elected president, almost that alone, in his House divided speech also, that we got to either go one way or the other with slavery. He was seen as a radical and a tyrant. And so 11 states left, even when he promised the states that had already established slavery that he wouldn't touch slavery in his first inaugural speech, right? That he just wouldn't let it spread to the new territories. But that wasn't enough. He got the South to as they nationalized their states' national properties like post offices and forts. At Fort Sumter in South Carolina, one of his officers refused to step down to the South Carolina, state militia, and the Confederates fired the first shots at him at that federal fort. So, and to a lot of people, right, the South, in the North at least, the South started this war. So at any rate, they said, they're not sorry for it. Nothing has changed. We fought and our boys died for nothing, virtually. So it worked, waving the bloody shirt and a backlash against the absolutely kind of autocratic, backwardly regressive ways of President Johnson. It backfired on him. And in 1866, a majority of radical Republicans are elected for the first time into Congress. All right. And radical Republicans, you have a positive court history interpretation of them and a more negative revisionist history. Court history is that they were ahead of their time. And we've gone over that time and again, right? They're exceptionally idealistic. They were bold, enforcing discourse on the slave issue, etc. The fact that they were uncompromising is seen as a good thing, etc. The negative side is written by a guy named William H. Dunning, Dunning. He was a Southern historian, and he believed that the radical Republicans did what they did for African Americans to weaken and punish the white South more than it was done out of any kind of humanitarian altruism for African Americans. All right. And then, of course, I look at people like Thaddeus Stevens in Congress, Salmon Chase, Charles Sumner, and I see both. I really do. I see both images. I see very progressive men who also made no bones about it. They wanted to put the South in its place. They wanted to subjugate the South, finally, after all this fighting. And so there's probably a punitive element involved as well. So, and remember also there's hypocrisy involved. Remember Howard Zinn states that of 19 northern states, only 5 had allowed some citizenship rights to some African-American men. That's pretty weak. And the draft riots, right? We won't die for the N-words, all that stuff in New York City. So it's messy. But at any rate, at this time, it's like momentarily the North was united and saying, we're going to put the South in its place. So they do just that. The new Congress, they do roll call in both houses, and they don't call any of the Southerners' names. They're like, excuse us, we're here. Why didn't you call our names? They said, oh, no, we don't recognize you. You're back to a territory again. And so now they had to go back and they had to agree to the 14th Amendment as well. And the 14th Amendment was really important to a lot of historians and a lot of people's minds. It finally gave an easy, broad criterion for citizenship. And simply is, if you are born or naturalized in any of the states. All right. If you're born or naturalized in any of the states, either or, not both, you are to be entitled to all the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship. Right? So it kind of nationalizes constitutional rights, the Bill of Rights and all that, to all states, and made it very easy to hit the requirement if you're just simply born in a state. So at any rate, they had to now agree to that. All right. And then there was a Section 2 or B clause. That's interesting. That's rather punitive. Is it stated that if at any time you had sworn to defend the Constitution, and then after that swearing in, you had subsequently broken that promise by joining the Confederacy, the rebellion, then you have broken your constitutional vow. And as punishment, you are to be disenfranchised or stripped of your citizenship rights for 2 years. So who had given vows to follow the Constitution? Basically, the leaders of the South, right? Politicians, army officers. That was the demographic that had sworn fealty to the Constitution and broken that oath. All right. So there was a punitive element to that. And then in some of the states, when the Southern Republicans, known as scalawags to the white racist South, Northern Republican immigrants who flooded in there, who were known as carpetbaggers, derisively, like parasites to enrich themselves, and then the newly enfranchised African Americans, right? That where they could really pull their numbers, they added to it. They added ironclad oaths in a few of the states, and the ironclad oath stated that you didn't even have to have promised on an oath to follow the Constitution, but if you had joined and participated in the rebellion of the Civil War, then you too were disenfranchised for 2 years. All right. They put the South into 5 military districts, and they kept the Union soldiers there stationed in the South like a conquering army. Right. And then not soon after this, they add the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment basically states that in case it's vague at all regarding the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship issued in the 14th Amendment, the right of suffrage, the third level of citizenship, political participation, is included in that list. And it shall not be deprived of anybody on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So they've made it explicitly clear you can't keep people from participating in government, citizens who are Black and who have been enslaved. There were 1 or 2 stubborn states that wouldn't agree to the 14th Amendment and write a new constitution that agreed to it. And so then they said, fine, you're not entitled to any of the rights. We're going to treat you as a conquered territory. And then by the time they came around, they said, now you have to also approve of the 15th Amendment. Okay. So there's a punitive element, according to William H. Dunning. Okay. But also, right, there might have been some genuine idealism going on. So for instance, even though the Freedmen's Bureau had been broken up, there was a torrent, a flood of middle-class women and other kind of early progressives, like the progressive movement later on, who flooded into the South to serve as teachers and nurses, etc., to African Americans in the South. All right. White Republicans, whether they were Southerners as scalawags or immigrants from the North, known as carpetbaggers, they openly identified with the freedmen, the African Americans who are now free and citizens. All right, as Republicans. So while this is all going on, right, there was certainly agency on behalf of the African Americans. So during the war, as you know, they absconded. They ran away, took property with them when their masters were gone fighting. They made demands upon the mistresses and others, and the overseers there on their plantations, demanding to begin to be paid when they saw the desperation of their the leaders of their plantation in the midst of the war. They joined the Northern Army and fought with the North, right? They also congregated together, forming these different types of, civic and fraternal organizations. The biggest one, I might argue, was the church, right? There was a mass exodus of Black Southerners from the white churches into their own. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of them became Methodist and Baptist, because the Methodist and Baptist prided themselves on being more democratic, egalitarian, saying that you don't need to go to Oxford or Cambridge, etc., Harvard, to get ordained as a minister, that if you have the Holy Spirit, you could lead etc. And so they were attracted to those denominations. So they formed their own churches. There was a lot of deference to their local pastors, their preachers. And of course, the preachers were heavily involved in politics, telling them who to vote for, apprising them of what their rights were and what was going on at the time, and all of that. They also participated in government. Get this, Eric Foner, Foner. I would recommend him if you want to read about Reconstruction. He's a very, very well-respected historian on the subject. But Eric Foner states that 90% of African-American freedmen regularly voted on election day for a time period. And that was despite the fact that at least 1 out of 5 was violently attacked going to the poll to vote by racist whites. They voted nevertheless. They ran for office, right? A part of their suffrage rights. Trying to remember the number here. It's in here somewhere, okay? But what you have is you had literally I don't want to give the wrong type of number, but well over 1,000 state assemblymen. So in the state legislators in the South, I know it had to have been well over 1,000 served as assemblymen alone that were Black freedmen, which is amazing, right? This is just absolutely novel. Now, at first, the African Americans were really big on not only learning their rights, not only congregated in churches and other fraternal organizations, but also teaching one another to read and write. Supposedly, from the end of the Civil War to some point in the midst of Reconstruction, they think that African American literacy rates went from well below 5% to over 40%. So literacy just skyrocketed. So a lot of them initially, according to Eric Foner, kind of psychologically adhered to traditional thinking that they ought to defer to their betters, right? And now when I say betters, of course, I mean it in quotes. I'm not meaning that they were any better. But basically, the type of African Americans that you would guess would have the collective and individual self-esteem to say, you know what, I'll lead them. So for instance, free African Americans who were not freedmen, because technically freedmen were the ones who had been slaves and were emancipated, right? But there were Black enclaves of free African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana, and Richmond, Virginia, etc. You had these enclaves of African Americans, because remember, although it was anomalous, it was out of the ordinary, there were emancipations in all the states. It happened. Sadly, it happened most often, from what I read, amongst women with biracial kids, and because they usually had slept with the master and had some type of an agreement, and they were eventually released. Also, those who lived in or near cities were more likely to be rented out as apprentices and, artisans, skilled workers, and they could keep a portion of what they made for their master as they were rented out, and they could accumulate, save that money, and pay the money of their value, their market value, as a quote chattel slave, chattel property. So those who had been free their whole lives, they largely were initially looked up to. Preachers were largely looked up to. Businessmen basically in that same group that had been free most of their lives. Yes, they largely had to only appeal to Black clientele, but you had everything from barbers, um, dentists, teachers with Black schools, vocational uh, uh, professionals who brought in apprentices, etc. And it was kind of, it formed as like a mini little like Black bourgeoisie, right? People of the city and more skilled and white collar jobs. So they were looked upon, and not to mention veterans. There was great pride in the African American men who had fought and served in the Union Army. However, according to Foner, within a year and a half, that trend started to change and things revved up as far as their novelty, right? From tradition, is then you see more of an appeal of people who had been actual slaves out on the fields to be elected as their assemblymen and their leaders. I believe there were 16 congressmen. There were 2 senators, Blanche K. Bruce, the father of Black education in Mississippi, and Hiram Revels. You had PBS Pinchback, who was a lieutenant governor. And like I said, most of them were state assemblymen, local sheriffs, local judges, and other positions as well. Land decisors, right? These like surveyors who go and assize or assess the value of someone's property. And you have these anecdotal stories of some ex-slaves getting to go and put the value on their old master's plantation. And the higher the value they put on it, the higher in taxes they had, property taxes they had to pay. So there was an element of a bit of a poetic justice that was going on during this time of radical Reconstruction. So what goes wrong? What goes awry? Why didn't it last? I mean, after all, we know you fast forward over 100 years and the civil rights movement seems as if they had to start from scratch again, right? Down into the South. Well, first of all, that collective unity and that the whole thing behind waving the bloody shirt, that common sentiment in the North, that radical change needs to be forced upon the South. The South needs to be put in its place. Like any sentiment, it waned in time. It died down in time. Remember, the Reconstruction was 12 years long. So you had people that were going and trying to fight the Native American tribes in the West. You had the cattle towns and the mining towns. Again, real popular, getting the public imagination in the West. You had the robber barons, the beginnings of their reign in the capitalist Northern economy, like the Rockefellers and Carnegies. So you have tons of things going on that are competing for the South's attention. And the attention supposedly just like I said, it ebbed, right? And then also economic problems in these new Southern states is a lot of them ran into the red, right? They got indebted. They engaged in deficit spending money that they didn't have. Because, you know, arguably, according to Eric Foner and W.E.B. Du Bois, because they were so bold in trying to bring about a new civilization down there in the South. So, for instance, public school systems were attempted in virtually every state. Infrastructure bills for railroads and telegraph wires, etc. Penitentiary reform and the construction of asylums and asylum systems for the psychiatrically ill. Orphanages for children. You know, these aren't free. You have to have money to devise all that, right? Public transportation, all this other stuff. And so, you know, they had these grand ideas, but they just didn't have the money oftentimes. especially in the South, as they're so libertarian and not wanting to pay taxes. And so at any rate, it didn't take long for the press in the South to contend that there was Negro misrule. That's the term they used. That, look at this African-American man is like the Sambo image in the minstrel shows. No control, no thought beside anything, whatever's immediately in front of him. No self-discipline. And what do you know? They're spending themselves into debt, right, in some of these states. Also, according to Negro misrule, corruption. There were some highly publicized cases of African Americans removed from office or even arrested for corruption. One was that, you have graft. Graft is when you, like insider trading. You find out through a city council meeting where you're going to develop a new business intersection in city. And before the public knows, but you know of it through your inside information, you purchase that property so that the city has to buy it from you, right? And you can make money from it. That happened. Also bribery. You have 3, 4 different railroad companies saying, I want to build railroads through your county. And so which one do you choose? Well, you're supposed to choose the one that gives the lowest price and the best offer quality, right? But they sometimes would accept bribes as to who they would give that monopoly to in transportation, etc. But guess what? W.E.B. Du Bois, a Black historian, gives a good defense of this. He says, firstly, the press absolutely assumed that the Southern states were led by, quote, Negroes. The only state that had a majority of Black politicians was South Carolina. That's it. So in all the other Southern states, you guys, they were a minority, even then, of politicians, etc. Secondly, the press exaggerated on a few infamous cases, and look at the amount of corruption that was going on in the entire country at that time. And Du Bois says the Southern African-American politicians had nothing on their Northern white counterparts for corruption. The Credit Mobilier scandal. Congress gives millions of dollars to the, not the Central Pacific, but the Union Pacific, the right part of the Transcontinental Railroad, right? They give millions of dollars to build a bridge. Well, engineer-wise, they find a way to circumvent that and not to have to build this costly bridge. Well, they didn't give the money back. They made up a phony Credit Mobilier construction company. They themselves were the owners of this phony company, of the railroad, and they pocketed it. Well, an investigation came from a Senate committee, and suddenly the issue is dropped, and then it comes up again. And when they're looking into the case, they find a large number of senators are suddenly major shareholders in the Union Pacific. And it hadn't been right before this. So they were bribed. They were being bribed to be quiet. And this was hush money, giving them stock and shares in their stock to let them get away with it. That's just one of a gazillion episodes. And that's why Mark Twain, right? He called it the Gilded Age in the 1870s. That just it looked nice and glittery and showy, but you scratch the system and all it was a superficial gilded job, right? Of a fine metal over the top of something corroded that wasn't fixed from within. And so this was known as the Gilded Age to Mark Twain. So this was, it's totally unfair blaming the African Americans for all that was going on in the country. And so when that happens, right, the white Republicans, they don't want to lose office. They're sensing their waning power and influence in the South. that people are tired of the Yankees telling them how to live. All right. Not to mention those who were disenfranchised in the southern states as the old leaders of the white South, 2 years ran out. So now they're citizens again. And they know how to dive right back into politics and have influence. And then you also have socially the KKK under Nathan Bedford Forrest. And they tried to terrorize not just African Americans, but white Republicans like scalawags, northern immigrants, carpetbaggers, literally threaten or kill them. So according to Eric Foner, a lot of the white Republicans, they folded under pressure, and they tried to separate themselves publicly in the public image from their black brethren and said, we will be more fiscally responsible if you elect us. We'll collaborate with our Southern Democratic neighbors, etc. And they went away from that whole paradigm of making a, ensuring equality of economic opportunity for all in the South. Because it is going to cost money, a lot of those safety net type of policies. So then, in addition to that, you have a presidential election in 1876 in which no one gets the majority of electoral points. Remember, someone gets the plurality, gets the most, but you have to have over 50%. It doesn't matter. So with no one having a majority, the Constitution says the top two are decided upon by the House of Reps. Well, I tell you what, nearly every time this has happened in our history, you guys, there's been some type of secret deal that was made. And this is no different. Rutherford B. Hayes told the Southern House Democrats, if you choose me as a Northern Republican, as the president over Samuel Tilden, who was a Northern Democrat, if you choose me from the opposite party, I promise to evacuate the troops from the South and let the South rebuild itself. Basically, no more Northern supervision, accountability, etc. It's known as the Compromise of 1877. So my thesis here, right, is pretty much already been said, is that despite African-American agency and doing what they could to help one another and help themselves, despite a brief period in which there was a great sense of unity in the North, that the South needed to be forced into progressive changes, that when the going got tough, black and white Republicans in the South failed to stay united. And I don't know if you'd say they lost their nerve. They capitulated to opposition. The Northern public lost interest. All of that and then some would probably describe the failure of Reconstruction. And by the way, the public schools, it was just white flight. White parents would not send their kids to the public schools with black kids. So sadly, the public school system took a downward turn at that point. All right. So, number two, pretty simple thesis, is I subjectively say that political remedies, economic changes, those absolutely could help rectify injustices. No doubt about it. I don't think anybody would claim otherwise. But those two realms alone, the political and economic, right? Instituting change in those two realms alone was never going to be sufficient. It just wasn't going to be enough if you don't deal with the social realm as well. If people hate Black people, call them the N-word, would never live next door to them, would never vote for them, would never intermarry with them, were disdainfully hateful toward them, you can pass whatever laws you want. You could give jobs and opportunities to obtain salaries, all those advances that African Americans got politically and economically. It's still not hitting the root of the problem. You need to change hearts and minds. So at that point, right, I concede that certain political remedies and economic changes were helpful, no doubt. But then I say, nevertheless, they weren't enough. All right. So I said, who dropped the ball in my estimation? Where could it have been done more effectively in the social realm? I say, first of all, it starts at the top down, the government and the military. Oftentimes, they did what they did for African Americans with the wrong motives. There might be some truth to Dunning's thesis. Look at Benjamin Butler during the war. He couldn't wait to confiscate the slaves of rebels, to punish them. And then once they were incorporated into his army, he was disdainful toward them and virtually enslaved them and made them do all the cooking, cleaning, burying of the dead that no one else wanted to do. And he thought they were a nuisance and didn't want them to have any rights. He wanted to simply divide and conquer the white South. All right. And then the president, Frederick Douglass, met Andrew Johnson the first time. He said Andrew Johnson saw him, Frederick Douglass, speaking with Abraham Lincoln. And he said he could not hide the most hateful, offended expression on his face and look in his eyes as he looked right into the eyes of Frederick Douglass. Because he couldn't believe that this Black man was talking to Lincoln as like a personal friend and almost equal. And he says, he has some quote, I have it in here somewhere, where he says, I knew at that moment that this man was not a friend of the Black man. So you have that type of president. Between Rutherford B. Hayes and Andrew Johnson, after Andrew Johnson, was the war hero Grant. And Grant gave his armed forces the right to declare martial law against the KKK, which was great. And by the way, when you read biographies of Grant, it reads a little bit like Court History of Lincoln, that he was at first indifferent about slavery, but as time went on, one observation and experience after another made him more and more progressive in wanting basic rights for African Americans. But how can you ensure anything with a lot of those? There's no way that it did not happen, that there weren't some white Northern soldiers down there finishing their term of service and hated being down there in the South and thinking disdainfully, I lost my cousin, I lost my neighbor for you Black folk, and now I have to stay down here and babysit you. These are all outward, external, perhaps helpful things, but they're not hitting the root. So I have here, for one, is the church, the Southern churches. You have evidence of evangelical reforms in the North that really were transforming ideologically, socially, culturally, that really stressed the equality of all human beings under God, that stressed camaraderie, cooperation, accountability. Oberlin College in Ohio invited African American students into it, and that was seen as just an absolute, shock to the rest of the country. But they were living out their religious beliefs. The Quakers, of course, have been ahead of their time. The Baptists and Methodists took strong stands against slavery. Well, those in the North. The Southern Baptists split over the issue, obviously. But nothing of that sort happened in the Southern churches. Could they have helped? Like the Northern churches and religious organizations seem to have helped bring about this type of, enlightenment in the North, if you believe there's any credence to court history as to what caused the Civil War. And could they not have done something better to try to ensure that Black and white kids go to school together and be socialized to do such, to interact? All right. So I mentioned the churches. I mentioned the schools. And then I mentioned the Southern intelligentsia. Remember when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he grabbed her by the hand with his two hands, and he kind of ironically chuckled, and he said, "So you're the little lady who started this big war." Like, that's how much credit he gave to Uncle Tom's Cabin as a book. Nothing of that sort was being written in the post-war South. Nothing to challenge people's assumptions, to challenge the Sambo image of African Americans. So the writers and just the intelligentsia, those whose jobs were connected to academia, to education, they could have used the written and spoken word to try to bring about some type of cultural change, but they didn't. So anyway, that's about it for number 2. All right, as I say that, it was great what they did economically and politically, but it was never going to be enough because they didn't do enough in the social realm to change people's hearts and minds. You see that last sentence. Legal and institutional remedies will never suffice for a problem in the human head and heart. All right. Yeah, Republicans in the North, they tried. There's a sad picture. It's a political cartoon, and it's a African American, and he is fallen to his knees, and he's looking up, almost up to heaven. He's got his hands up, like, where did the North go as far as the abandonment of the North? It's a real telling picture. It's powerful. All right, but I think I gave you all the information you need to know, not only for the assignment, but I think for the questions on test 3 that pertain to Reconstruction. All right. And in case you can't make it to our final one, just the basics, because we're already an hour in, on fighting the Civil War, is I need you to remember that the North had a finally used its logistical advantages well. They had something called the Anaconda Plan, where they would squeeze the South from getting any resources and help from without, along the Atlantic coast, the Gulf of Mexico beneath them, and the Mississippi to their west. The U.S. Navy dominated the Confederate Navy. That helped. Northern soldiers outnumbered Southern soldiers about 3-1. Northern industrial capacity to replace guns, ammunition, uniforms, boots, food, etc., was much, much greater than the South's. And then you have a very intriguing story of two men who were good friends, and one fought for the other. That was William Tecumseh Sherman fighting for his boss, Ulysses Grant. Grant is depicted as having a huge chip on his shoulder. His dad had played favorites with his brother, didn't think he'd have much prospects ever as his second son. He had a lot of failure in his early life. He went to DC to beg for a position in the Civil War to lead men, and Lincoln gave him nothing. Hadn't heard of him, not interested. He begins fighting when he's not even given permission to fight with his men at Shiloh. And it's a very telling thing is Halleck, his boss, court-martialed him for recklessness with his troops. And Lincoln now has Lincoln's attention, Grant. And Lincoln pardons Grant from the court-martial as the president, as the commander-in-chief, and says, I can't spare this man. He fights. And then if you look up the Wilderness Campaign, Grant just almost just like a possessed man was intent on defeating Lee. He'd lose battle after battle to Lee, but he kept chasing him and pushing him back with his superior numbers. And his predecessor, McClellan, wouldn't use the men to fight. He was extremely passive. So in Grant, Lincoln got a fighter. Right? And then Sherman. It's almost I say this half jokingly, but it's almost a bipolar thing with Sherman. In his earlier history, he was court-martialed for his indecisiveness in battle with his men that got a lot of his men killed. He wept often on the battlefield at the beginning of the war. He had a nervous breakdown when he was put in charge in an office job in Tennessee. And something snapped at him when he got a second chance with Grant at Shiloh in the midst of that bloody battle. And something also snapped in him when his men, as he moved down into the Deep South, kept getting sniped in southern towns where there were no soldiers. He starts retaliating against civilians. He burns infrastructure down, railroads, telegraph wires, major government buildings, any factories that are going to help provide anything. The Shenandoah Valley, which was the breadbasket for the South, he had Philip Sheridan burn it to the ground to try to starve out the Confederacy. Instead of requesting goods when he went to different cities, he told his men to go and pillage Southern houses. But he got to the south of Lee's army just in time to bottle him up, with Grant above him and a guy from the Navy on the coast oared to keep him from going east to the coast. And they bottled him up at Appomattox. You had lost opportunities in the South when they went up into the north at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and they almost took Cemetery and Culp's Ridge, the flanks, on more than one occasion. They didn't even know how close they were. And then they did that silly charge right up the middle at Pickett's Charge, which proved to be suicidal. So Lee would love to have had that back. At least the first Battle of Bull Run, at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam, by the way, was the bloodiest battle of the war. The South was very near Washington, D.C. They're in Maryland. And critics contend to this day that they could have burnt D.C. to the ground and maybe even taken Lincoln as a prisoner. There's another guy named Jubal Early who marched on D.C., but inexplicably didn't attack for the South. Also, what might have been if the South had succeeded in gaining a military alliance with either France or England or Great Britain. And they supposedly almost did. So all the would-haves and could-haves in history. All right, so I'll give a more truncated version of all that and kind of going straight to the answers when I cover the test. Okay, soon, next week, early next week. But I thought since you're here, just in case you can't make it, I'd share that with you now. Because that's the only subject, right, that we skipped was the fighting the war assignment. All right, so you guys feel okay?
Yes, I feel okay.
Okay, good, Jacob. Thank you.
We missed you last week, I think.
Yes, I ended up getting on 35 minutes late. I sent an announcement, but that's on me. Yeah,
Oh.
I started it at 4:35. I'm sorry.
Oh. That's okay.
The irony was I was right here at my desk doing schoolwork.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and just time got away from me. I apologize.
No, that's all right. So, I guess we're approaching the end then of the class.
Yes, this is the final assignment. And then you have only until I think Thursday night to submit this and test 3. And that's it.
And test 3. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very well. Well, is this going to be our last Zoom meeting?
No, I'm gonna have one more.
Okay, next Thursday
for the test. Yeah, I'm gonna have one more, and like I said, I'm gonna try to do it Monday or Tuesday instead of Thursday because I feel like Thursday's too late because I think everything has to be due that night.
Okay, so you'll just announce it then?
I will, absolutely.
All right then, very well. I guess then we have another one coming. So, all right.
All right. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And also remember, you guys, I'll say it again, hopefully I'll remember to, is some points are better than none. If you were to have missed any of the assignments of the past and you ended up submitting it now, like 25 days late or more than that even, I might subtract like 15 points. But 35 points can mean the difference between one letter grade and another. So 35 is much better than 0. So make sure you don't have any blanks on your assignments, okay?
Right.
Claire.
I was just wondering, like, as for the third test, does it cover like just everything we've covered, like a cumulative?
No,
Yep.
hon, it's not accumulative.
Okay, so is it just the material since the last test?
That's right.
Okay.
That's
And
right.
also, I was just wondering, just like when we'll have our grades back.
I know that. I'm terrible.
It's okay. I just need to like report it like by a
Well,
certain.
I think they declare formally the end of the semester. They go by the very last final. And I think evidently, I've never had one, but evidently there's a Saturday class, a few. So I think next Saturday not this coming one, but the next one, is officially the end of the semester. And then we have 48 hours from there to submit our final grades. So I have to have them by not this coming Tuesday, but the one after that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll try my best. I'm sorry, hon.
No, it's fine. I just wondering.
Right. I make sure I have everyone's name.
The Civil War, which is what you just went over.
Uh-huh.
Is that it? And then you mentioned a test.
Yeah, so just test 3.
Oh, test 3, it's not posted yet then, huh?
It may not be,
I don't see it.
but that should be no problem because I've already done a test 3 for an online class at my other school. So yeah, I should be able to just copy it and paste it onto your guys's. That should take me no time at all to put the test up.
Okay, then I'm just asking, that's all.
Yeah.
Very well.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? Let me think about something. I always allow unlimited submissions, almost always, on the first test. Second and third, no. This is college, no, etc. But I have dropped the ball more with this class than I think I have in all my years of teaching. So I might even consider allowing you guys to have more than one shot at this test.
Wow. I won't say no to that. I said thank you with 2 thumbs up.
Now, you guys have put up with a lot this semester. You have. A couple times I didn't even show up to the Zoom. 3 or 4 weeks. I didn't post the assignment until Thursday. I had to give you extra time. Honestly, I know it.
Well, all that's understandable though, teacher. So that's life. You don't have to stress about it. We understand. At least I understand.
Well, I appreciate that.
Sure.
But yeah, so if any of you, okay, if I forget this, what I'm saying right now, remind me. If any of you make it to the Monday or Tuesday Zoom, remind me and ask me, about my consideration of giving more than one shot at test 3.
Will do.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys. Well, thank you.
All right.
I hope to see you one more time if you can make it.
Absolutely. At least me. Yes, absolutely.
Good. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
See you later.